Winter, 1943. On the frozen plains of the Eastern Front, the German Tiger, the Weise, begins its reign. It moves through the mist like a living fortress, its 88mm cannon turning Soviet armor into scrap before the gunners even hear the shot. Entire regiments halt at the sound of its engine, a deep mechanical growl that seems to announce invincibility itself. To the men who face it, the Tiger is not a machine. It is an event. Word spreads westward through rumor and fear. In North Africa, British tank crews report that their shells bounce harmlessly off its thick plates. In London, intelligence officers sketch its outline from fragments of wreckage and disbelief. Across the Atlantic, American soldiers study those sketches with a kind of awe. The field reports read the same. Direct hits ineffective. Recommend retreat or air support. The Tiger, they conclude, cannot be fought, only endured. For German tank crews, it is a weapon of both war and pride. They name their tanks like knights, once named their swords: Anneliese, Brunhilde, Siegfried. Inside the steel hull, they sit high above the battlefield, confident, detached, convinced of their mechanical immortality. To them, the enemy's fear is proof of German genius. They drink coffee from tin cups on their turrets and joke that no infantry weapon on earth can even scratch their armor. But technology has never respected arrogance for long. Across the Atlantic, in dimly lit laboratories and small ordnance workshops, American engineers stare at blueprints that promise something different. They speak quietly of a weapon not made to compete with the Tiger, but to erase the balance it represents, a device small enough to rest on a soldier's shoulder, yet powerful enough to melt through inches of steel. It sounds impossible, almost foolish, but the physics are sound and the need is desperate. While the Tiger rolls forward through smoke and legend, the weapon that will one day hunt it is already being born in secret. It will not roar or thunder, it will whisper, and its whisper will burn. But what the German crews could not imagine was that the next enemy they faced would not come in another tank at all. It would come on foot. In 1942, while German tanks carved their name into Europe, far from the front lines, a small group of American engineers worked in near anonymity. Their laboratory smelled of cordite, oil, and ambition. The problem before them was both simple and impossible. How could a man on foot destroy a fortress of steel? Until that moment, the answer had always required another machine: a tank, an aircraft, an artillery gun. Infantry could only hide or flee. But at the U.S. Army's Aberdeen Proving Ground, someone dared to imagine a different future. A single soldier, kneeling in the mud, armed not with armor, but with chemistry. The idea had been waiting since the 1930s. In European experiments with shaped charges, scientists learned that explosives could do more than blast. They could focus. A cone-shaped cavity could turn a simple detonation into a jet of molten metal, narrow as a finger, fast enough to pierce steel like paper. It was physics, not magic. Yet to those who saw the results, it felt supernatural. Army ordnance officers decided to build a launcher around this discovery. They found their answer in a scrap of tubing, a shoulder-length pipe fitted with a crude trigger and a battery cell. When fired, it would launch a small rocket with the precision of a rifle and the heat of an industrial furnace. It had no recoil, no elegance, and no precedent. When the first prototype fired in a Maryland field, the observers laughed. The projectile hissed from the tube like a child's toy and buried itself harmlessly in the dirt. But a few days later, after refinements to the fuse and angle, the next shot hit its mark, a section of tank armor mounted on a wooden frame. The explosion left not a dent, but a hole. The steel around it had melted inward, edges curled and blackened, as if struck by lightning. The laughter stopped. Someone joked that the launcher resembled a stage prop used by comedian Bob Burns, a long brass musical instrument called a bazooka. The name stuck. Within weeks, the weapon that looked absurd on the workbench began appearing on requisition lists, stamped confidential, anti-tank rocket launcher, M1. Its simplicity was its genius. 2 men could carry it, one aimed, one loaded. No recoil meant no training in gunnery, no need for complex sights. It was the first true portable rocket weapon in history, and it did what rifles, grenades, and courage could not. It gave infantrymen the power to stand their ground. In tests, the shaped charge warhead burned through 3 inches of homogeneous armor, leaving the smell of scorched iron drifting over the range. Officers watched in silence, realizing what it meant. The age of invincible tanks was ending. Still, there was doubt. Could something this small survive the chaos of combat? Could ordinary soldiers handle rockets without setting themselves on fire? The engineers insisted they could. The army decided to believe them. Orders were placed for thousands, rushed into production even before the manuals were written. The bazooka did not look like a revolution. It was a tube, a wire, and a rocket the size of a man's fist. Yet within that simplicity lay a truth that would echo through every war to come, that in the right hands, innovation mattered more than mass, and imagination was the most lethal weapon of all. The engineers at Aberdeen packed their prototypes into crates bound for North Africa. They had built something few understood and fewer trusted. But soon, on the dusty battlefields of Tunisia, the world would see what happened when a man with a pipe could challenge a machine born of arrogance. And when that moment came, the laughter that once greeted the bazooka's birth would be heard no more. North Africa, 1943. The desert was a place where technology met its limits. Heat warped metal, sand devoured engines, and even courage seemed to melt under the sun. It was here that America's newest weapon, a strange tube carried by 2 men, faced its first trial by fire. The infantry called it a bazooka, though few believed it would amount to more than an experiment. The first shipments arrived in wooden crates, hastily labeled and poorly understood. Instructions were brief: connect the wire, load the rocket, aim, and fire. In theory, it sounded simple. In practice, it was chaos. The early models overheated, batteries failed in the heat, some rockets refused to ignite, others misfired, spinning into the dust like fireworks gone wrong. Soldiers cursed the contraption and went back to rifles and grenades, weapons they trusted. Then came the first contact with German armor. Columns of Panzer IIIs and Oivos moved across the dunes with practiced precision. Against them, American infantry crouched behind ridges, clutching their untested weapons. A bazooka team took aim, fired, and watched the rocket streak off harmlessly into the sand. The Germans didn't even slow down. The laughter from inside the tanks carried over the open desert. But technology learns as fast as men do. Each failure brought an adjustment: new fuses, cleaner contacts, more stable propellants. By late February, the weapons crews had become engineers in the field, filing their own solutions into the metal. A handful of improved rockets reached the front lines, their shaped charges refined by scientists half a world away. When the first of those struck home, everything changed. A Panzer IV rolled into range near Gafsa, its crew confident, its armor glinting in the light. A bazooka round fired from 80 yards hit the lower hull. There was a flash, a pause, then a dull concussion that echoed through the sand. The tank halted, black smoke rising from its vents. The crew stumbled out, coughing, confused. The soldiers who witnessed it said nothing for a long time. They had seen something that should have been impossible. Word spread faster than proof. A single success became a rumor, and a rumor became belief. In the field manuals, The weapon remained experimental. Among soldiers, it became a promise. Crews learned to wait for flank shots, to aim low, to move before the return fire. The bazooka was no longer a toy, it was a tactic. German intelligence officers noted the reports with mild amusement. American gadgetry, they called it, clever but unreliable. They had no reason to think otherwise. Their tanks still ruled the battlefield, their armor still shrugged off artillery, yet in small skirmishes along forgotten desert roads, that certainty began to erode. Charred wrecks appeared where none should have. Survivors spoke of a bright streak and an instant of fire. It was too early to call it a revolution. The weapon was crude, temperamental, and dangerous even to its users. But something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in the war, a man on foot could look at a tank and see a chance, not of escape, but of victory. The Germans dismissed it as luck. The Americans called it progress. History would call it the beginning of the end for the myth of invincibility. And somewhere in a quiet factory in the United States, another engineer was already drawing the design that would turn that fragile hope into certainty. By the spring of 1943, the battlefield had become an anatomy of fear. In the valleys and wadis of Tunisia, the Tigre rolled forward for the first time against American troops. It was not fast, nor agile, but it did not need to be. Its 57 tons of steel and an 88mm gun gave it the poise of inevitability. Where it moved, everything else simply moved aside. The men who faced it could hear it long before they saw it. The rhythmic clatter of tracks, the low thunder of a Maybach engine, and then the impossible shape emerging through the haze. The Tiger looked less like a tank and more like a verdict. Shells that had crippled Panzer III's now bounced from its armor with the hollow sound of futility. Even the air around it seemed to change. Calm turned to panic, and soldiers whispered prayers more than orders. Bazooka teams were told to wait in ambush, to hold their nerve until the Tiger exposed its flank. They crouched in gullies, behind shattered olive trees, gripping the tubes that were supposed to even the odds. When they fired, the rockets left trails of smoke and hope, but most hit and fizzled out, leaving black smudges on unscarred armor. Some rockets struck at perfect angles, only to ricochet away in humiliation. And before the teams could reload, the Tiger's turret turned, slow and deliberate, until its cannon spoke once and ended the lesson. Still, soldiers adapted. They learned to aim for the tank's weaker points, the exhaust vents, the treads, the thin plates near the engine deck. They waited for the moment it crossed open ground or pivoted too sharply. Some paid with their lives for the attempt, but each engagement became a classroom, and every fallen crew left behind a page of instruction. Far away, in laboratories and proving grounds, engineers watched the film reels of these failures. They froze the frames, measured blast patterns, traced the shape of craters in the sand. The footage showed courage breaking against physics, and it forced them to think faster. Warheads were redesigned overnight. A new conical charge, a sharper copper liner, a faster burning propellant. Each modification was tested not for theory, but for redemption. The race between armor and flame had truly begun. Every Tiger destroyed was no longer just a tactical success. It was data, the raw currency of industrial evolution. For every tank that shrugged off a hit, a better rocket was already being drawn on a drafting board. In this invisible duel, progress replaced heroism as the weapon of survival. The Germans did not see this change coming. To them, the Tiger remained a symbol of unshakable superiority, its armor thicker than doubt. But the men inside could not hear what was happening beyond their own triumph. The quiet hum of factories, the pencils scratching on blueprints, the engineers who refused to accept limits. While the Tiger's armor grew heavier, its enemies grew smarter. In the end, the tank's greatest weakness was not its design, but its arrogance. For every inch of steel added to its hull, a new formula of fire was being prepared to burn through it. The Desert War had shown both sides the same truth, that every innovation is only temporary, every advantage fleeting. And as the Tiger lumbered back into the smoke, unaware, the engineers who watched it from half a world away were already planning its extinction. June 1944. When the Allied Armada reached the beaches of Normandy, the men who stepped into the surf carried everything they could: rifles, rations, radios, and, slung over many shoulders, a strange green tube. It was a weapon most of them had never fired in Miranga. The bazooka was still a rumor among soldiers, a promise wrapped in thin metal. No one yet knew if it would keep that promise. The first days ashore were chaos. The land beyond the beaches, the bocage, was not the open countryside the planners expected. It was a patchwork of sunken lanes and hedgerows, so thick they could stop tanks and hide entire platoons. The war that followed was fought at the distance of breath, in fields bounded by living walls. For tank crews, it was a sniper's paradise. For bazooka teams, it was a trap and an opportunity. The Tiger and Panther tanks that had once ruled the open plains now found themselves caged. Their long guns, designed for duels at 1,000 meters, were useless when the enemy was 30 yards away and invisible behind the greenery. In those moments, the battlefield belonged not to the heaviest armor, but to the stillest nerve. American infantry learned to listen. The grinding of gears, the slow crush of earth beneath treads, the metallic cough of a German engine turning over somewhere unseen. When they heard it, they froze. 2 men would crawl into position, one carrying the launcher, the other the rocket. They waited as the sound drew closer, hearts beating in rhythm with the tank's advance. At 20 yards, the gunner rose, steadied his aim, and fired. The rocket's trail burned white against the green. The shaped charge struck the flank of the tank with a sharp, metallic thud. Then silence, then fire. Sometimes the rocket missed, sometimes it failed to detonate. But when it worked, the result was devastating. The tank became a furnace, its crew silhouettes against the flame. German radio intercepts captured the growing panic. "Men with rockets in the bushes," one message read. "They fire once, then vanish." Officers called for more infantry screens, for artillery to clear the hedgerows before tanks advanced. But there was no safety now. The Tiger's armor, once its pride, had become its prison, too heavy to run, too slow to hide. Each engagement taught the Americans something new: the best range, the right angles, the moments when the German crew's confidence would blind them. Each mistake was corrected by evening. By July, entire squads operated as ghostly hunters: move, fire, relocate. The bazooka, once doubted, had found its natural terrain. The Germans adapted too. They learned to spray the hedgerows with machine gun fire, to send infantry ahead as bait, to call airstrikes on suspected ambushes. But it was too late. The fear had already taken hold. Tanks no longer advanced without hesitation. Every shadow seemed armed. Every roadside a trap. Armor had ceased to mean safety. To the infantrymen, the bazooka was more than a weapon. It was parity. The man on foot could finally dictate terms to the machine. In that realization lay a quiet, dangerous confidence. The bocage had become a killing ground, not of glory, but of grim efficiency. Fire met steel, and for the first time in history, fire began to win. But as the hedgerows burned and the Tigers withdrew, few realized that every rocket fired in Normandy was sending a message home, to the engineers who would soon build something even deadlier. War, by 1944, had become less about courage and more about comprehension. The American bazooka, once a crude pipe on a soldier's shoulder, was entering its second life, reborn not on the battlefield, but on the assembly lines and drafting tables of a nation that refused to accept limits. In laboratories from Maryland to Massachusetts, engineers worked without rest, feeding field reports into formulas. Every misfire, every dud, every near miss from Tunisia or Normandy became a lesson etched in blueprints. They studied the angles of impact, the temperatures of steel, the flow of molten copper under detonation. The goal was no longer simply to destroy tanks, it was to understand them, atom by atom. The new rocket that emerged, the M6A3, was a triumph of science disguised as simplicity. Its heart was the shaped charge, a copper cone folded inward and fused with explosive so volatile that at ignition it transformed chemistry into geometry. When the rocket struck, it didn't punch through armor, it melted through it. In less than 1,000th of a second, a jet of metal over 2,000 degrees Celsius and traveling at 6,000 meters per second turned steel into vapor. No plate, no weld, no reputation could stop it. Behind this miracle stood the unsung armies of industry. Ordnance factories glowed day and night under fluorescent light, filled with men and women who might never see the front, but who fought it nonetheless. They built with rhythm, weld, inspect, repeat, and in that rhythm lay the quiet precision of modern war. Every launcher assembled in Ohio, every rocket packed in Pennsylvania, meant one more chance for an infantryman to survive an encounter with a tiger or panther. The launcher, too, evolved. The M9 was lighter, collapsible, and more reliable. It used electrical ignition instead of a dry cell battery, its design tested to function in mud, snow, or desert wind. It was no longer a prototype, it was an instrument, and the men who carried it were no longer amateurs. Training manuals changed to reflect this new philosophy. Courage alone no longer defined success. The manuals spoke of angles, of impact trajectories, of the optimal 30-yard range and the precise moment to fire as the tank crossed a gap. Soldiers became mathematicians of destruction, learning not only where to shoot, but why. They measured their fear in degrees and meters, reducing the chaos of battle to the cold elegance of numbers. The German army, once dismissive of American gadgetry, began to take notice. Reports flooded Berlin describing tanks destroyed by single shots, armor scorched in perfect circles. At first, generals blamed luck, then they blamed sabotage. But as losses mounted, they were forced to confront the truth. The Americans had made science into strategy. The shaped charge was something entirely new, a weapon of invisible war, fought not in the fields of France, but in the equations of laboratories. Its power lay not in the size of its explosion, but in the precision of its design. It turned physics into a soldier's ally, and with it, the infantry regained its relevance in an age of steel giants. As improved bazookas poured into Europe, the laughter that had once echoed from inside Tiger turrets faded into silence. German crews began to fear the unseen, to hesitate before advancing into narrow streets or wooded paths. They no longer mocked the thin green tube carried by the man in the ditch. They understood what it meant, that every step forward might ignite a molten truth they could not escape. The balance of power had shifted quietly, not through brute force, but through intellect, the kind that measures war in millimeters and milliseconds. And as those rockets found their mark across Europe, another transformation was already underway, one that would carry the weapon from defense to dominance. July 1944. The Norman countryside lay shattered beneath weeks of bombardment. What had once been hedgerows and farms was now a labyrinth of smoke, mud, and ruin. The roads near Saint-Lô were narrow, bordered by high earthen banks that turned every lane into a funnel, perfect ground for tanks or for traps. That morning, a German Tiger platoon rolled out from the tree line, their engines growling like an approaching storm. 4 machines, each weighing nearly 60 tons, advanced methodically toward an American column pinned down ahead. Their commanders believed they were untouchable. The Tigers had survived everything the Allies could throw at them: artillery, aircraft, even anti-tank guns. They expected the same today. But hidden among the wreckage and smoke was something new, something the German crews had not yet learned to fear. A bazooka team of 2 men crouched behind the blackened hull of a Sherman tank, its gun twisted and useless. The loader wiped his hands on his uniform, steadying the rocket's fins. The gunner adjusted the sight, breath held. They had waited hours for this moment, listening to the slow, metallic rhythm of treads grinding toward them. The Tigers emerged through the haze, their armor glinting in fractured sunlight. Every few seconds, one would pause to fire, the concussion shaking the ground. Each shot tore another crater into the French soil. The air smelled of oil and cordite, the heavy perfume of mechanized war. At 30 yards, the lead Tiger filled the bazooka gunner's viewfinder. He whispered a count under his breath. 1, 2. The rocket hissed, a streak of white across the fog. It struck the tank's left track, snapping it from the sprocket with a crack that echoed down the lane. The Tiger lurched sideways, its hull grinding to a halt. Inside, the crew scrambled to understand what had happened. Before they could react, the second rocket flew. This one found the turret ring, that thin, fatal seam between armor plates. For an instant, there was silence, then a dull thump, followed by a bloom of orange fire that burst from the commander's hatch. The tank became a furnace, its ammunition cooking off in a chain of muted explosions. The crew stumbled out, faces blackened, eyes wide, coughing smoke. The ambush continued. From another hedgerow, a second team fired, a third joined from the flank. The confined road turned into a shooting gallery of invisible hunters. In less than 5 minutes, 4 Tigers, Germany's most feared weapons, lay crippled and burning. The beasts that once dominated the battlefield now smoldered in ditches. Nearby infantry, stunned by the sight, began to whisper the same phrase over their radios. The bazooka killed the beast. It wasn't official language, but it spread like wildfire through the ranks. For the first time, ordinary soldiers believed that the monster could die. News of the ambush reached headquarters within hours. Field officers recorded every detail, studying the firing angles and distances. The photographs that followed, wrecked Tigers, armor plates split open like tin, were passed from unit to unit. In them lay proof of a new reality. Fire could now beat steel. For the Germans, the psychological blow was immense. Their finest tank, the pinnacle of their engineering pride, had been brought down not by another machine, but by 2 exhausted soldiers hidden behind scrap metal. The arrogance that once fueled confidence in the Tiger's invulnerability began to corrode from within. Crews no longer advanced with the same certainty. Every shadow became suspect, every silent hedgerow a potential death sentence. The Americans, meanwhile, grew more deliberate. The ambush at Saint-Lô became a model, the perfect intersection of courage, technology, and terrain. Doctrine evolved in days. Infantry manuals were rewritten to describe what had once been instinct: patience, placement, precision. The bazooka had graduated from novelty to necessity. When the smoke finally cleared, the wrecks were left smoldering in the French summer heat, their burned-out hulls marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. The myth of the invincible tank had died quietly on a country road. and as the flames died down around Saint-Lô, the message spread across Europe: no armor was absolute, and no empire could hide behind it forever. By late summer 1944, something unsettling had begun to spread through the German armored corps, a rumor that felt like superstition. Entire Tiger platoons were being lost, not to artillery or aircraft, but to something unseen. Tank crews spoke of ambushes that came from hedgerows, alleys, even from within the smoke of their own bombardments. They described no gunfire, no cannon shell, only a streak of light, a hiss, and then fire. At first, these reports were dismissed as exaggerations, the kind of fear that grows in retreat. But as the wrecks accumulated, the tone of the messages changed. Technical officers began to attach photographs to their reports, burned through armor plates, holes no larger than a fist. A shaped charge, they wrote, not artillery. Infantry rockets, bazookas. For the first time, the word appeared in German field memos, often underlined, often followed by a question mark. No one quite understood how such a small weapon could deliver so much destruction. Hitler himself demanded explanations. He summoned engineers, metallurgists, and officers to briefings that stretched into the night. Their answer, though technically precise, carried an unmistakable undercurrent of despair. The Allied rockets, they explained, did not rely on brute force. They used science, heat, pressure, and chemistry to turn metal into liquid. No amount of armor could guarantee protection. Hitler's response was predictable. Then build thicker armor, he ordered. Make the tanks stronger. And so, the engineers obeyed. Side skirts were added, plates were thickened, and weight climbed past the limits of logic. The Tiger, once formidable, began to devour its own strength. Engines overheated, transmissions failed, fuel consumption doubled. Mobility, the essence of survival, withered away beneath layers of steel. What the Führer could not see from his mountain headquarters was that every ton of armor he added only made the Tiger easier to trap. It was now a giant without ground to stand on, forced to crawl along predictable roads, dependent on fuel and luck. For every new Tiger that rolled out of a German factory, 5 bazookas arrived in Allied hands, each costing less than $20. To compensate for this vulnerability, German commanders issued new orders. Tanks must never move without infantry screens. Every village, every crossing, required escort units to flush out potential ambushes. The result was paralysis. What had once been the spearhead of blitzkrieg became a slow, lumbering convoy, advancing mile by mile under the constant fear of fire from nowhere. Inside the tanks, morale cracked. Crews began to flinch at shadows, to mistake every smoke trail for a rocket. Veterans, once proud of their machine's invincibility, now whispered in mess tents about the rocket men. Some refused to advance through wooded terrain. Others blamed the engineers, or the generals, or fate. But deep down, they understood that the balance had shifted, not by power, but by principle. The bazooka had made the individual soldier dangerous again. German propaganda tried to bury the truth. Newsreels continued to show Tigers crushing enemy positions, their armor gleaming, their cannons unopposed. Yet the frontline letters told another story. "We can no longer trust the armor," one crewman wrote. "It burns too easily now." The myth of invulnerability, that sacred belief in steel, was dying from the inside out. The Tiger had reached its evolutionary wall. What once symbolized the genius of German engineering had become the weight of its arrogance. Against mathematics, metallurgy, and mass production, pride could not compete. And as the Reich's tanks grew heavier, slower, and fewer, the weapon that destroyed them remained light enough to carry on a soldier's back. In the ruins of Europe's factories, The engineers of both sides were already imagining the next evolution, a weapon that would make even the bazooka seem primitive. In the United States, war had become an act of rhythm. Across the industrial heartland, factories hummed like an orchestra of steel, presses, welders, and lathes beating out the cadence of modern power. What began as scattered workshops had become a continent of motion, bound by schedules and conviction. Here, in the echoing halls of industry, the bazooka was reborn by the millions. Women in coveralls stood at welding benches, sparks dancing in arcs of light. They worked through the night under fluorescent lamps, their hands blackened, their eyes steady. Each piece they handled, each launcher, each rocket, looked unremarkable on its own. But together, they formed something larger than any single weapon, a machine made of people. The bazooka had once been a fragile experiment, a novelty on the battlefield. Now it was a product of precision and repetition, a symbol of what America had learned faster than any nation before it. That power no longer belonged to the perfect, but to the repeatable. Thousands of tubes rolled from the conveyor belts each week, painted, stamped, and boxed, every one of them identical, every one of them ready to give a single soldier a fighting chance. The weapon's simplicity made it democratic. It did not require a factory-trained crew to use or a master engineer to repair. It required only two men, a steady hand, and courage measured in seconds. In that sense, it mirrored the society that built it, decentralized, adaptive, built from the strength of individuals working together towards something larger than themselves. From Detroit to Des Moines, from the shipyards of California to the ammunition plants of New Jersey, the United States turned raw material into power faster than any empire in history. Steel arrived as ore and left as destiny. Even as the front lines in Europe shifted, the real war was being decided in the silence of drafting rooms and the roar of production floors. German officers studying captured weapons began to notice the pattern. Their strength, one report concluded bitterly, is not in their weapons, but in their endless weapons. The observation was more than complaint. It was prophecy. The Third Reich had built masterpieces, each a triumph of craftsmanship and precision. But perfection is slow, and in total war, slow is fatal. By contrast, America built for volume, not vanity. Its engineers accepted imperfection as the price of momentum. What mattered was not the flaw in one rocket, but the speed of the next 1,000. It was an industrial philosophy that mirrored its people, practical, restless, unwilling to stop. German intelligence could not comprehend it. How could a nation so young, so far removed from the traditions of militarism, produce an arsenal greater than all of Europe combined? The answer lay not in doctrine or blood, but in infrastructure. America had turned its factories into front lines, its workers into soldiers, its blueprints into battlefields. Every rivet hammered, every box shipped, was an act of defiance against the notion of limits. The bazooka became the physical proof of this transformation. For every tank Germany built, America produced 1,000 rockets to destroy it. For every Tiger crew trained, there were hundreds of soldiers learning to wield the tube that could end its reign. The weapon was more than a tool. It was an equation the Reich could not solve. To the German crews who faced it, it seemed as if the very air had turned hostile. Every ridge, every alley, every hedgerow could hide a man with a rocket. There was no longer safety in armor, no longer pride in steel. The Tiger's roar now echoed in fear of the silence that preceded a launch. By the winter of 1944, Allied depots overflowed with crates of ammunition. So many that commanders joked the bazookas could pave a road from Normandy to Berlin. Behind every shipment was the quiet strength of a nation that believed in process over perfection. The Germans had once trusted genius. America had trusted geometry, production, and patience. And as the fronts collapsed and the Reich retreated, one truth emerged from the noise of industry. Quantity had become its own form of quality. But while the factories continued to build, the soldiers who carried these weapons would soon learn that victory had its own weight, a moral burden no engineer could measure. Autumn, 1944. The air along the western frontier of Germany carried the smell of rain and ruin. What had once been the Reich's shield, the Siegfried Line, now stood as its last line of hope. Concrete bunkers, dragon's teeth, and miles of interlocking defenses stretched from the Netherlands to Switzerland. But behind those walls, the army that once threatened the world was running out of everything: fuel, men, and faith. For the Americans advancing east, the landscape felt like an open wound. Towns burned quietly on the horizon. Forests were filled with mines and wire. Every hill concealed something that could kill. The old strategies, the armored thrusts, the massed artillery began to falter against fortifications buried deep into the earth. It was here, on this immovable frontier, that a new kind of soldier began to lead the way: the man with the bazooka. The weapon that had once hunted tigers in hedgerows now found a second purpose. Against bunkers, pillboxes, and fortified machine gun nests, the bazooka became a siege tool. Its shaped charge, once designed to melt tank armor, could pierce the walls of reinforced concrete. Soldiers carried spare rockets on their backs, firing from ditches, craters, and shattered buildings. Each detonation carved a hole through walls that artillery couldn't reach. In the chaos of the Siegfried Line, tactics inverted. Tanks that once led now followed. The armored columns hesitated, wary of ambush, waiting for infantry to clear the way. It was the bazooka men who moved first, crawling through wire, through shell holes filled with water, through fields that had forgotten what grass looked like. The line between survival and destruction was measured in seconds of aim and the distance of a single rocket's flight. American platoons reorganized around them. Manuals were rewritten, and commanders began to assign entire fire teams to protect and support the bazooka operator. The weapon was no longer a novelty, it was doctrine. Each soldier knew that if the bazooka man fell, progress stopped. His tube became both spear and shield, the one thing that could open the next door forward. German officers watching from the bunkers gave it a new name: Geisterkanone, the ghost gun. They could not hear it coming. Its rocket made little sound before impact, and its effects seemed disproportionate to its size. Men whispered of invisible hunters who could appear, strike, and vanish before the smoke cleared. To counter it, the Germans built heavier doors, thicker embrasures, more elaborate fields of fire. But for every new defense, the bazooka found a new weakness. Crews learned to fire at vent openings, at cracks where concrete met steel, at the junctions where air could feed the explosion. The weapon had become an art, and its practitioners, young, exhausted, mud-covered infantrymen, were its reluctant artists. In one village near Aachen, an entire company of tanks waited behind a row of houses, unwilling to advance until the bazooka teams cleared the way. The irony was clear. Machines that had once inspired terror now required the protection of men. The hierarchy of war had been rewritten. Man once again commanded the machine, not the other way around. By winter, the Siegfried Line began to fracture. Pillboxes that had withstood artillery for days fell within hours. Bunkers once thought impregnable were left in flames, their gun ports torn open by molten jets of copper. The Allies advanced, yard by yard, not through overwhelming force, but through ingenuity carried on shoulders. For the German defenders, it was a slow, humiliating undoing. They had built their walls to defy the armies of the world, yet they were now being undone by a weapon that cost less than a single tank tread. The same factories that had forged their armor had unknowingly forged their downfall, because every defense they strengthened only invited a more precise countermeasure. When the smoke cleared and the Siegfried Line finally fell, the landscape bore witness to a new truth. War was no longer about size or spectacle. It belonged to the adaptable, to the men who learned faster, who turned invention into instinct. But even as the bazooka opened Germany's final gates, the weapon's creators began to ask a quieter question. If man could master destruction so completely, could he ever master himself? By late 1944, the German war machine was no longer an architect of fear. It was a student of desperation. Reports of burning tigers and immobilized panthers had reached Berlin, and the reality could no longer be hidden beneath propaganda. The Reich, once the teacher of modern warfare, now found itself copying its enemy's homework. In scattered workshops and underground factories, engineers worked feverishly to reclaim the advantage. They studied captured American bazookas, crude in appearance but devastating in effect. Within months, they unveiled their own answers, the Panzerschreck and the Panzerfaust, both borrowed from the same principle that had once humiliated them: the shaped charge, the molten jet that could turn armor into ash. The irony was unmistakable. The nation that had once mocked American gadgetry now staked its survival on an American idea. The Panzerschreck, or tank terror, was essentially a larger, heavier bazooka, firing an 88mm rocket designed to burn through even the thickest Allied armor. Its power came at a cost. The backblast was so fierce that gunners wore asbestos face shields, their silhouettes illuminated in the darkness after every shot. The Panzerfaust, meanwhile, was brutal in its simplicity. A disposable launcher, cheap enough to be issued to farmers and teenagers alike. It was not elegance that mattered now, only immediacy. Soon, the battlefield became a mirror. On both sides of Europe's collapsing front, soldiers knelt in the mud, loading similar tubes, trusting the same physics, aiming for the same fleeting opportunity, the gap in armor, the second before the turret turned. The war that had begun with nations trying to outbuild each other had ended with both armies using nearly identical weapons to destroy the same idea, the supremacy of the machine. Infantry combat devolved into a grim contest of reflex and nerve. In the streets of Aachen, in the forests of the Hürtgen, the air was thick with the hiss of rockets, German and American, indistinguishable in sound, identical in consequence. Men faced each other across rubble, both armed with the same invention that promised survival through annihilation. It was as if progress itself had turned against its makers. Yet the outcome had already been written in steel and supply. For every Panzerschreck the Reich produced, America shipped hundreds of bazookas. For every Panzerfaust distributed to a desperate militia, American factories delivered crates of rockets by the trainload. The math was merciless. Germany's genius was individual, precise, inventive, but unsustainable. America's was collective, industrial, anonymous, and endless. The Tiger still prowled the battlefields, but now it did so timidly. There were too few, too heavy, too thirsty for fuel. Each time it moved, it risked destruction from an unseen rocket or a soldier it could not reach. The tank that had once symbolized power had become a relic of an age that was collapsing under its own weight. In the ruins of Europe, the line between invention and imitation blurred completely. The same shaped charge idea that had once revolutionized warfare now existed in every trench, every alley, every desperate hand. Innovation had turned inward, a serpent eating its tail. The tools of progress had become their own undoing. By the spring of 1945, both sides were armed with weapons capable of piercing any armor ever built. But by then, armor no longer mattered. The Reich's cities burned under a different kind of fire. One dropped from the sky in endless waves. Rockets could kill tanks. They could not stop history. And so, as the war approached its end, the shaped charge stood as a symbol of the age it had defined: ingenious, unstoppable, and self-destructive. What began as a marvel of engineering had become a warning about innovation without restraint. For even as the last tigers smoldered and the factories fell silent, another weapon was already being born, one that would make every invention before it seem primitive, and every victory feel hollow. Spring 1945. Germany was collapsing inward, cities hollowed by fire, fields turned to mud, and soldiers retreating through their own ruins. What remained of the once proud armored divisions now moved east and west in scattered, frightened fragments. Among them prowled a few surviving tigers, not as predators anymore, but as ghosts. Each machine carried the memory of its myth. Once, its mere appearance had frozen enemy lines. Now it rumbled through empty villages, its great engine coughing, its fuel dwindling, its armor blackened from too many near escapes. These were not the unstoppable beasts of Kursk or Normandy. They were the last lions in a dying forest, their power rendered meaningless by the scale of their defeat. On the roads and in the woods ahead, the hunters were waiting. Bazooka teams, veterans now of France and Belgium, moved silently between the trees, their weapons scarred by months of use. They knew the tigers' habits, how they turned, where they idled, the blind spots their armor could not protect. The men crouched in ditches and cellars, waiting for the vibration that announced a tank's approach. The sound no longer inspired terror. It inspired precision. Every rocket fired in those final months carried more than explosive charge. It carried memory. It was the answer to the years when German armor had ruled every battlefield, when Allied shells had bounced harmlessly from its plates. Now the shaped charge jet struck like judgment itself. It didn't shatter steel, it melted it. Under the invisible pressure of the bazooka's flame, even the tiger's thickest armor glowed red, buckling inward, surrendering to physics it could not resist. In those brief encounters, seconds decided everything. A tiger could still kill at 1,000 yards, but its vision was narrow, its reaction slow. The bazooka man, crouched and waiting, needed only a moment, one clean angle, one chance to fire and vanish. What had once been the most terrifying machine on Earth was now terrified itself. For the crews inside, the fear was suffocating. They could no longer see their enemies. The rocket came without warning. No gunfire, no shell arc, only a sudden hiss and a white flash that turned daylight into heat. Veterans who had survived dozens of battles now fought in panic, swinging their turrets toward every shadow. Pride had become paranoia. By war's end, statistics told the quiet truth. More tigers were destroyed by infantry-carried rockets than by any opposing tank. It was not a rival machine that killed them, but a concept, the democratization of power. The age of invulnerability had ended not with an explosion, but with a whisper of fire from the hands of ordinary men. When the surrender came in May, the remaining tigers were scattered across the landscape, abandoned on roadsides, bogged in rivers, hidden in barns. Their hulks stood like monuments to a vanished idea, that superiority in design could overcome inferiority in numbers. The men who had built them believed in perfection. The men who destroyed them believed in adaptation. To walk among those wrecks after the war was to see the passing of an era. Rust crept over the armor that once gleamed beneath banners. Grass grew through the tracks, inside the burned-out shells. Sunlight poured through the same holes where molten copper had cut through steel. Nature was reclaiming what technology had only borrowed. The tiger had been born as a symbol of dominance. It died as a symbol of hubris, proof that no machine, however strong, could outlast the minds determined to defeat it. But even as the last tigers lay silent, the world was already forging new weapons, guided by the same relentless curiosity, the same desire to make the next invincible thing. When the war ended, the smoke did not clear so much as settle. Across Europe, in depots, testing grounds, and captured factories, engineers picked through the debris of a technological revolution. The bazooka, once a field improvisation built from pipe and battery wire, was now recognized as something far greater. It was the seed of a new kind of warfare, one where chemistry and geometry mattered more than armor and weight. Military researchers from every nation descended upon the ruins of the Reich. They found not only wrecked tigers and panthers, but also the German counterweapons, the Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck, crude, powerful, and ingenious. These weapons, born in the final desperation of Nazi industry, became the genetic code of post-war design. Their captured blueprints were packed into crates, shipped east and west, and studied with equal intensity by engineers in Washington and Moscow. From those fragments, two legacies emerged. In the West, NATO refined the American principle of precision and portability, the bazooka evolving into the M20 Super Bazooka, then into guided systems like the Law and Tau. In the East, the Soviets took the Panzerfaust's simplicity and turned it into the RPG, a weapon as cheap as it was enduring. Between them lay a single truth, though infantrymen would never again be powerless against armor. The balance of fear had shifted permanently from the machine to the man. For the veterans who had first carried the bazooka, the revolution was more personal. In post-war interviews, many spoke not of pride, but of disbelief. They described the first time they watched a tank's armor bubble and collapse under the heat of a shaped charge, how the sight filled them with awe, then unease. It wasn't a bullet, one recalled quietly. It was like the tank melted from the inside. The battlefield, they realized, had become chemistry, a contest of reactions, molecules, and pressure. The soldier was no longer just a fighter. He was a mechanic of destruction, wielding forces once reserved for laboratories. Each pull of the trigger released a burst of physics so precise, so violent, that even victory felt like trespass. The tank, that icon of 20th century warfare, would never again rule uncontested. Its armor could grow thicker, its guns larger, but the shaped charge, elegant, efficient, inescapable, had rewritten the rules. From the frozen forests of Korea to the jungles of Vietnam, and later in the deserts of the Middle East, the pattern repeated: one man, one launcher, one moment of fire against the weight of steel. It was not the bazooka itself that endured, but what it represented, the industrialization of individual power. For the first time in history, a single soldier could carry the destructive potential of an artillery piece. The line between human and machine blurred further, not through size, but through understanding. The weapon made ordinary men participants in the great experiment of modern warfare, the experiment of control. Historians would later write that the bazooka changed tactics. The truth is deeper. It changed perception. It taught armies that no creation, no matter how mighty, was beyond defeat. And it taught mankind that its genius, unchecked, could just as easily turn inward. The war that ended in 1945 had been fought with steel and fire. The wars that followed would be fought with equations, weapons born from data, refined by reaction, perfected by repetition. And as the last veterans of that age faded into memory, one lesson remained clear. Humanity had learned not only how to build power, but how to carry it, and how easily that power could burn through its own hands. Courage, once measured by the charge, found a new shape in stillness. In the world the bazooka created, bravery was no longer the act of running toward the enemy, but of waiting for him. Calm, patient, invisible. The soldier's heart beat not to the rhythm of heroism, but of mathematics. He did not meet the tank head-on. He let it come to him, trusted the weapon in his hands, and the physics that now governed fate. The battlefield had become an equation. Distance, angle, armor thickness, fuse delay. Patience replaced panic. The man who could wait, calculate, and strike once with precision carried more power than entire regiments from wars past. Courage had evolved, and with it, the morality of war itself. In that shift lay an uncomfortable truth. Technology had changed not just what men could do, but what they were asked to be. To hold a bazooka was to hold the promise of victory and the weight of annihilation. It turned the battlefield into a realm where restraint mattered more than rage. The tiger's fall became a parable, one not only of engineering but of ego. It had been magnificent, powerful, beautifully designed, a machine born of obsession, but it was also doomed by the very perfection that defined it. Germany's pride had built a weapon too heavy for the world it sought to rule, too complex for the war that demanded simplicity. The tiger was not defeated by another tank. It was defeated by its own reflection, by the belief that greatness could be forged from arrogance. Across the ocean, America's victory came not from beauty, but from balance. The bazooka was not graceful, it was not elegant, yet it embodied something deeper, the understanding that power must serve practicality. Strength had to move, to adapt, to multiply. A single tube of steel and copper carried the weight of an idea. That progress was not in the pursuit of the perfect, but in the perfection of the possible. The contrast between the tiger and the bazooka was the contrast between two philosophies of war, one seeking awe, the other seeking efficiency. Germany built monuments, America built momentum, and momentum, in time, conquered everything. The bazooka proved something even older than warfare itself, that ingenuity defeats intimidation. The greatest fortresses fall not to force, but to thought. The mightiest machines crumble before the quiet precision of invention. For centuries, men had believed that armor, in metal, in doctrine, in empire, could protect them from change. The bazooka ended that illusion. It showed that no armor is absolute and no empire invulnerable. Every advance creates its countermeasure. Every wall invites the tool to breach it. Progress, in its truest form, is both savior and destroyer, a mirror reflecting the dual nature of human ambition. What saves us one day will haunt us the next. When historians look back, they see in the bazooka not only a weapon, but a warning. It democratized power, and with that came its own danger. Once, destruction belonged to nations. After 1943, it could belong to anyone with a steady hand and a shaped charge. In that irony lies the final lesson of the Inferno, that every step forward burns the path behind it. For as the smoke of one war faded, the blueprint for the next already waited in the minds of men who still believed they could build their way to peace. In 1943, when the first rumors spread through the German armored divisions of an American rocket that could pierce steel, they laughed. Tank crews sitting on their Tigers and Panthers mocked the idea. They believed in armor, in engineering, in the myth of invincibility that had carried them across continents. They had seen their 88mm guns tear through Allied armor like paper. The notion that a man on foot could challenge a tiger was to them absurd, an insult to German precision and to the hierarchy of war itself. But by 1945, the laughter had gone silent. The same men who once sneered at the thought of handheld rockets now moved through battlefields with dread in their eyes. The sound that haunted them was not the roar of enemy engines, but the faint hiss of fire, the whisper of a bazooka rocket cutting through air before melting through armor. The Tiger's roar, once the anthem of dominance, had been replaced by the quiet efficiency of the infantry's revenge. Every destroyed tank was not just a tactical loss, but a moral reckoning. The symbol of mechanical supremacy had fallen to something designed in a workshop, assembled by factory workers, and carried by soldiers barely 20 years old. The bazooka had done more than kill tanks. It had killed the illusion that war belonged to giants. What began as laughter in 1943 ended in the silence of realization. The Tiger, the ultimate expression of German pride, now burned in ditches and forests, its armor blistered and torn open like paper by molten jets of copper. Crews once proud of their engineering now fought blind, turning turrets toward shadows, fearing enemies they could not see. Their invulnerability had been a story, and stories do not survive physics. The war, in its cruelty, had revealed an ancient truth, that strength without humility collapses under its own weight. Germany's war machine had been magnificent, but magnificence alone cannot endure. The same obsession with perfection that birthed the Tiger also blinded its creators to simplicity, to adaptability, to the quiet genius of a weapon built not for awe, but for purpose. In contrast, America's victory was not built on brilliance, but on balance. The bazooka was never perfect. It misfired, overheated, and sometimes failed at the worst moments. But it could be fixed. It could be built again and again, by the thousands, until the idea outweighed the flaw. That was its true power, not the heat of its flame, but the reach of its concept. The bazooka's rise marked a transformation not only in warfare, but in philosophy. It proved that innovation is not the privilege of the few, but the weapon of the adaptable. It shifted power from the factory floor to the foxhole, from the engineer's drawing board to the soldier's grip. In the space of 2 years, the hierarchy of war had inverted. The tank, once untouchable, now lived in fear of the individual. And yet, behind this triumph lay a shadow. The same principle that gave every man a weapon strong enough to destroy a fortress would echo far beyond the war that birthed it. From its shaped charge came the lineage of every modern anti-armor weapon, from the Panzerfaust to the RPG, from the bazooka to the missile. It was the beginning of an age where destruction could be carried in a single hand, an age where progress and peril would walk the same path. When the smoke cleared and the world began to rebuild, the burned shells of Tigers were left where they fell, monuments of rust and memory. Grass grew through their tracks, rain pooled in their turrets, and children played in their shadows, unaware that these hulks had once ruled the earth. The machines endured as relics, reminders that even the strongest creations are only temporary defenses against time and thought. History does not remember who laughed first, it remembers who learned. The war did not just end nations or armies, it ended certainty itself. The bazooka, simple and small, became a symbol of the idea that even the mightiest designs can fall to a better question. From the mud and ruin rose a new truth, that ideas burn deeper than shells, and that arrogance, once lit, consumes its maker. They laughed once, they never laughed again.